Before we begin, a quick note. The opinions and analysis shared on Truth Seekers are our own interpretations of published research and should not be used as medical, financial, or professional advice. Always consult qualified professionals for decisions affecting your health or well-being.
And with that out of the way, welcome to Truth Seekers. I'm Bill Morrison.
And I'm Alex Barrett. Today is February 9th, 2026, and we're talking about your gym membership won't save you from your desk chair.
Let's get to the truth.
Right, so I've been seeing this headline absolutely everywhere for the past few weeks, and it's properly alarming. Sitting for more than 10.6 hours a day increases your heart failure risk by 40 to 60%, even if you exercise. I work from home, Bill. I sit at least 10 hours a day. Am I doomed?
Yeah, I saw that one too. And here's the thing. It's based on a legitimate study from Harvard researchers published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. So it's not junk science.
Okay, good.
But that headline, that's doing something really sneaky with the numbers.
Of course it is. Okay, before we get into the sneaky bit, what did they actually study? Because 40 to 60% sounds absolutely terrifying.
So they tracked about 89,000 people from the UK Biobank, average age around 62. They had them wear wrist accelerometers for a week to measure how much they were actually sitting, then followed up to see who developed heart disease. The people who sat more than 10.6 hours a day had worse cardiovascular outcomes than people who sat less.
Right, and that's where the 40 to 60% number comes from.
Sort of. Actually, the main finding was a 45% increased risk for heart failure specifically. But here's what I need you to hear. That's a relative risk increase, not an absolute risk. And that difference, it's everything.
Okay, you're going to need to break that down for me because when I see 45% increased risk, I'm thinking I have a 45% chance of getting heart failure.
Exactly. And that's exactly what the headlines want you to think.
Right.
But check this out. Let's say your baseline risk of heart failure is 2%. So out of 100 people like you, 2 would develop it. A 45% relative increase means your risk goes from 2% to about 2.9%.
Okay.
That's less than a 1% actual increase in your personal risk.
Hang on. So the 45% is comparing how much more likely you are than someone else, not your actual chance of getting the disease.
Precisely. Relative risk tells you the comparison between two groups. Absolute risk tells you your actual probability. And the study, and definitely the headlines, never give you the absolute numbers.
Huh, that's quite misleading, actually. So, what's my actual baseline risk?
That's the problem. We don't know from this study. They only report hazard ratios, which are relative comparisons. For most people in their 60s, heart failure incidence is somewhere in the 2 to 5% range over several years. So we're probably talking about an absolute risk increase of 1 to 3% max.
Which is very different from you have a 45% chance of heart failure.
Completely different.
I'm annoyed now. When I was covering health stories, we'd get press releases that did this all the time. Bury the actual numbers, lead with the scary percentage. And editors loved it because it got clicks.
Oh, I bet.
Cancer risk doubles. Right, from 0.0001% to 0.0002%. But who cares about that when you've got a headline?
Yeah, when I was doing A/B testing, we'd do the same thing in reverse. If we wanted to downplay a negative result, we'd report absolute numbers. Only a 2% increase in churn, but that 2% was actually a 40% relative increase from baseline. You can make the same data tell completely different stories depending on which metric you choose.
That's grim.
It is.
Anyway, what were we saying about the study? There's more, isn't there?
Yeah, so the study divided people into four groups based on sitting time. The lowest group sat less than 8.2 hours. The highest sat more than 10.6 hours. But here's what caught my attention. They didn't compare the highest sitters to the lowest sitters.
Wait, what did they compare them to?
They compared them to the second group, people sitting 8.2 to 9.4 hours a day. So they're comparing really high sitters to medium high sitters, not to people who sit very little.
So the 45% isn't even sit a lot versus sit a little, it's sit a lot versus sit a moderate amount.
Exactly. And that makes the relative risk look bigger than it would if you compared high sitters to people who only sit, say, 5 hours a day.
Okay, but let's talk about the exercise part because that's what really got to me. The headline says, even if you exercise, like your gym membership is completely pointless.
Right. And that's where the media really distorted what the researchers actually found. The study looked at whether people met the recommended 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous activity. And for two of the outcomes, atrial fibrillation and heart attacks, exercise basically did eliminate the excess risk from sitting.
Wait, so exercise worked for those?
Yeah, the risk disappeared. The only outcomes where the risk persisted even with exercise were heart failure and cardiovascular death. And even then, the researchers said exercise partially mitigates the risk. It helps, just not completely.
So the headline, even if you exercise, is technically true for heart failure specifically, but it leaves out that exercise does protect you from other heart problems caused by sitting.
Exactly. And honestly, the researchers themselves were way more cautious than the headlines. One of them, Dr. Ajufo, said it's more complex than that and acknowledged that exercise does counterbalance sitting to some degree.
Of course, the researchers were cautious, they always are. Then the press release goes out, and suddenly it's your desk chair is a death trap.
I do want to flag something important here, though. This is an observational study, which means they tracked people and looked for associations. They can't prove sitting caused the heart disease.
Right, because there could be other things going on.
Exactly. Like people who sit 11 hours a day might be dealing with depression, which is linked to both sitting more and heart disease. Or they might already have early stage heart problems that make them sit more, reverse causation. The study tried to adjust for some of these factors, but they couldn't measure everything.
And they only tracked people sitting for 1 week, right? That's not necessarily representative of what someone does year round.
Yeah, that's another limitation. And actually, the sitting measurement itself has issues. Wrist accelerometers can't perfectly distinguish between sitting and just standing still. Research shows they're only about 60% accurate for classifying sitting.
Okay, wait, hold on. Only 60% accurate.
Yeah.
So we're basing all of this on measurements that are wrong 40% of the time.
Well, not exactly wrong, more like imprecise. They're better than self reported data, where people just guess how much they sit, but they're not perfect.
Right, but doesn't that undermine the whole thing? If you can't accurately measure who's actually sitting for 10 hours versus 8 hours, how do you know the association is real?
That's a fair point, but the measurement error would actually tend to weaken the association, not create a false one. It's called regression dilution. If you're misclassifying some high sitters as medium sitters and vice versa, it makes the groups more similar, so any real difference gets smaller.
Okay.
The fact that they still found an association despite the imperfect measurement suggests the real effect might actually be stronger than what they reported.
That's actually quite good reasoning. Okay, I'm somewhat convinced.
Only somewhat?
I'm just saying there's a lot of limitations here. 1 week of data can't prove causation, measurement issues. The UK Biobank volunteers are healthier and wealthier than the general population.
That's true.
So we've got relative risk reported as if it's absolute risk, a reference group that inflates the comparison, unmeasured confounding factors, 1 week of imperfect data, and headlines that ignore the fact that exercise does help for most outcomes. At what point do we say this study doesn't tell us much?
No, I actually think that's too harsh.
Do you?
Yeah, I mean, look, the limitations are real and they matter. But the association between sitting a lot and cardiovascular problems is consistent across multiple studies. This one used objective accelerometer data, which is way better than asking people, how much do you think you sit? Because people are terrible at estimating that.
Fair.
And the finding that exercise doesn't completely offset sitting for heart failure specifically, that's actually new and worth paying attention to. It suggests there might be something about prolonged sitting that has independent effects beyond just being inactive.
So you think the study is good?
I think the study is solid and adds something to what we know. The problem isn't the science, it's how it got packaged for public consumption.
Okay, I can agree with that. The researchers found something interesting and nuanced, and then the media turned it into sitting will kill you and exercise can't save you.
Exactly. Which is exactly the kind of headline that makes people either panic or just tune out health advice entirely because it feels hopeless.
Right, so what should people actually do with this information, assuming they haven't already tuned out?
If you sit a lot, like more than 10 hours a day regularly, this is a nudge to move more. Get up every hour, take walking breaks. Maybe look at whether you can reduce total sitting time where it's practical.
Okay,
But the idea that your exercise routine is pointless, that's not supported.
and the 45% number is a comparison, not a personal probability.
Exactly. Ask yourself 45% compared to what? What's my actual baseline risk? Because without that context, the number is essentially meaningless.
The thing that frustrates me about this is that the study itself is actually valuable. It adds to what we know about sedentary behaviour. But when it gets filtered through the headline machine, it becomes fear mongering.
Yeah, and the researchers even said it themselves. Dr. Kershid said avoiding excessive sitting is important for lowering risk, not that it's definitive or that you're doomed if you have a desk job.
Important versus you're going to die. Two very different messages.
Here's what I think the real story is. Sitting a huge amount, like 11, 12 hours a day, appears to have some health costs that aren't completely erased by hitting the gym for 30 minutes. That's worth knowing, but it's not a reason to panic, and it's definitely not a reason to skip exercise.
So the boring advice remains move regularly throughout the day, meet your exercise guidelines, manage stress, see your doctor if you have symptoms.
Exactly. The stuff that works is still the stuff that works. This study just adds more evidence that breaking up sitting is probably beneficial.
Right. I think the lesson here is the same one we keep coming back to. When you see a percentage in a health headline, ask what it's actually measuring. Relative risk, absolute risk. They sound similar, but they mean completely different things.
And if the headline doesn't tell you compared to what, that's your red flag that someone's playing with the numbers to make them scarier.
Brilliant. I'm going to go stand up for a bit now. Not because I'm terrified, but because I've been sitting for 2 hours and my back hurts.
That's probably the most honest reason to move more anyway.
Right, that's all for today's dive into the data. Just remember, everything we've discussed is our interpretation of published research and shouldn't replace professional medical advice.
Absolutely. If you're dealing with health or mental concerns, talk to your doctor, not just us data nerds on a podcast.
I'm Alex Barrett,
And I'm Bill Morrison
and we'll see you next time.
on Truth Seekers,
Until then, question everything.
but verify with data.